been asked.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to talk diplomacy because that's what we do here in this committee. And hands down, one of the biggest things asked, I think probably to all of us, either side of the aisle, is what are you doing? We see China visits Russia, Russia pulls out of New START. We see balloons flying over America. We see China testing hypersonics. And the question constantly is, what are you doing? And one of those forms of diplomacy that we have to deal with this is the entity list, correct? I mean, that's one of the ways that we help deal with this, to say, listen, you can't get the nut, the screw, the bolt, the epoxy, the semiconductor, the pencil to draw it up if that's what we decide. You can't get what you need, China, Chinese, Communist Party company. You can't get what you need to make those things that threaten America or our allies, because we're going to put you on a list, correct? Correct understanding, Mr. Estevez?
I wouldn't call it a tool of diplomacy, but correct understanding.
You wouldn't say, I mean, I look at diplomacy in this way, and I always ask this question is, does our support equal our policy goals? So if we're allowing somebody to get something, that's a form of support. If we're stopping them from getting something, those are diplomatic efforts, right?
Close.
All right, well, I'll take that. You said close. We'll say it's close. So, sir, Mr. Estevez, looking at those entity lists, I'll call it a form of diplomacy, whether we're going to let Chinese Communist Party entities get the supplies that they need to build things that are a threat to America, America's allies, and Americans. In order to do that, this list, how many have you published in the last year? How many have you recommended to go up to the Federal Register? I know you talked about 12 recently.
We've put 160 entities on the entity list since the beginning of this administration. That's about a quarter of the entities in the PRC, and the entity list goes back to the 90s.
Very good. So when we look at this, and I want to bring Wendy Sherman into the conversation and say, it's been the conversation, I believe, from Wendy Sherman that state agrees with the action, you guys having the end user review for that. But there's really somebody higher than you all, and that's whether it's Mr. Crittenbrink or Wendy Sherman or Blinken. They might ultimately decide if those end user reviews are going to be put into the Federal Register, correct?
There's an interagency process. We never go up that high, to tell you the truth. Only 1.1% of discussions over licenses or entity lists have even go up to the Assistant Secretary for adjudication, because usually there's pretty good consensus on what goes on the list,
right,
based on the evidence that we have.
There's a process, but even if you all recommend that review goes forward and put it on the register, if Secretary Blinken or Mr. Crittenbrink or Wendy Sherman decide they don't want that on there, that's not going on there, is it?
The process actually flows a little differently than that.
Mr. Crittenbrink, would you like to
respond? Once we have the vote, we put people on the list.
Congressman, yes, thank you. I think we collaborate exceptionally well with our colleagues at Commerce, and not just Commerce, but Energy and DOD as well, who are also part of this process. And our goal is to do exactly what you've outlined. The entities list is designed to prevent China or other actors from acquiring U.S. technology inappropriately or to use for their military modernization in ways that would threaten our interests. So
let's
we're very supportive of that effort.
Question on that then.
Yes, sir.
Since I'm glad we have both of you sitting here. So how many PRC entities have passed that end user review, the committee, that have not been published yet?
I'm not aware of any.
None.
None.
Very good. That'd be great to hear. Do you want to consult with your staff and make sure that that's the case? Anybody behind you?
I don't have to do that.
Mr. Crittenbrink, are you familiar with any that Ms. Sherman might think that she agrees with the action but doesn't agree with the timing because it might piss off China?
Congressman, I would say that once a proposed entity listing is approved by these four agencies, this regulatory action in the ERC, it goes on the entity list. That is the process.
It doesn't just go there. You all have the opportunity to pull that back as higher leadership in the State Department.
I think what I would say, Congressman, is that we feel like our job, the reason why we have this consultative body is to sit down these 4 agencies and to think through all of the implications. Is this proposed action going to achieve our goals? Is it potentially going to inadvertently harm our own interests or the interests of allies and partners? We have to think through all of those things. But once we reach consensus and we vote, those actions go forward and are published on the entities list.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Mr. Kim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our panelists for coming today. Mr. Crittenbrink, I wanted to start with you. I guess I just wanted to ask you, how central to the work that we're trying to do in the Indo-Pacific, especially vis-a-vis China, how important is coalition building to our strategy and our efforts there?
Well, Congressman, I would say it's absolutely vital. It's central to what we do. As the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific, I spend the vast majority of my time and my Bureau's time on building the coalitions that you're talking about and what we refer to as building the collective capacity of our allies and partners and friends to work together with us to support the rules-based international order and to counter all challenges, including those posed by the PRC. It's absolutely central, and I would argue it's the most important thing that we do.
I very much agree with you that it's so central, and to the point you said, perhaps the most important thing that we're trying to do. And I think this committee, we've talked a lot about, in the context of Ukraine, just how central that coalition was for our efforts over there. But what we also recognize is that in many ways our coalition in the Indo-Pacific, it's much more fragmented and segmented in some ways than it is over in the transatlantic. So I guess I want to ask you, what does this kind of coalition building 2.0 look like? What is this next level that we can do to try to take that and add some greater gravity to it and pull it together?
Well, thank you, Congressman. Again, we talk about building a lattice work of an interlocking web of relationships. We start with our treaty allies, our 5 treaty allies in Asia, Japan, Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and Thailand. I would argue that our alliance relationships are stronger than they've ever been before, and we're working together, not just in bilateral ways to improve our security, but increasingly in trilateral and multilateral ways to advance our shared interests, not just in the security realm, but in economics in terms of promoting our values. And then beyond that, I'm sure you've seen, Congressman, the President hosted an unprecedented summit with the leaders of ASEAN last year. He hosted another unprecedented summit with the leaders of the Pacific Island countries. We've formed new informal mechanisms such as the Quad, the Partners of the Blue Pacific, again, forming these interlocking webs of relationships that we think are absolutely vital.
And trying to build that trust there and that partnership there, it's so important.
Absolutely. And, sir, I feel like my number one duty every day and the duty of my colleagues is to demonstrate the credibility of our commitment to the region and to our partners, to let them know that they can count on us and let them know that we'll all be better off, more prosperous, more secure if we work together,
So
including in countering threats from the PRC.
There's a little bit of a debate here about how best to be able to build this coalition. I want your thoughts on it. I've had a number of people come to me and say we should be applying greater pressure to some of these partners that we're working with in the Indo-Pacific, pushing them to more definitively choose between the United States and China. And I guess I wanted your thoughts on whether or not that would help or hurt your ability to build the coalition you need.
Well, Congressman, I would say, generally speaking, we don't try to force countries to choose. They tell us that they don't want to choose. Most countries in the Indo-Pacific don't need an education on the threat posed by the PRC. What they want to know is how can they work together with the United States and increasingly together in these interlocking webs of relationships to advance our shared interests. The way we look at it is we're not asking countries to choose. We're working to make sure countries have choices and to make sure they can make their own sovereign decisions free from coercion. And if we do that, I'm confident that we will prevail in this competition and will continue to preserve the free and open region toward which we're working.
One thing that I've heard when I was out there in the region talking to some of our vital partners there is they do have concern about some of how we're approaching vis-a-vis China, our rhetoric, our posture. And I guess some of their concern was saying that they really want to work with us and continue to be a partner, but that may be more difficult for them if they feel like or is perceived like the United States is the instigator for aggression or provocation in that relationship between the U.S. and China. Do you hear the same from partners that you're talking to?
I do, Congressman. Look, I think it's important that we always demonstrate that the United States is a responsible actor, that we are committed to the rule of law, to peaceful resolution of disputes, committed to the rules-based regional order. And when we do that and when we work together with our partners, I think that's when we are most effective. And I think it's quite clear across the range of issues we've discussed today, I think it's quite clear which party is taking steps to undermine the rules-based.
And I think that's something we can highlight while underscoring that we are that responsible actor. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for you and the ranking member holding this very important bipartisan hearing related to the threat from the Chinese Communist Party. Secretary Estevez, in your testimony, you state that in FY 2022, BIS and its interagency partners approved approximately 69.9% of license applications involving the PRC and denied or returned without action approximately 30% of such license applications. How many of those BIS licenses were approved for companies on either DOD's 1260H list of Chinese military companies or Treasury's Chinese military industrial complex companies list?
Unfortunately, Congressman Barr, I'd have to get you that information, which I'll be happy to.
Does BIS have that information at your fingertips?
When we vote through the interagency, obviously, defense can bring, first of all, defense can propose anything they want. And defense can raise the concern over any license based on their list.
Well, here's the concern I have, and you and I have had a good conversation about this. The lack of coordination and the lack of visibility across agencies, big problem, big problem. How important is it that Commerce Entity List designations be coordinated or be cross-referenced by OFAC or Treasury or DOD for purposes of sanctions to prevent American investors from financing entities tied to the CCP or these Chinese military industrial complex firms that are still included in emerging growth index funds, either on U.S. exchanges or foreign stock exchanges, or even through private equity or credit investments?
There's a lot to unpack there. Obviously, investors should be looking at all those lists. As far as coordination between myself, the Treasury Department, and Department of Defense, we actually have pretty excellent coordination going on right now, certainly with regard to what we're doing.
Well, I'm not sure we do. Sorry, reclaiming my time. I'm not sure we do, because the OFAC list that's subject to the EOs, they're not aligned, frankly, with your entity list, and certainly not with some of these other lists, the military end user list, the unverified list even. And here's what I would just say editorially, and we're going to be looking at this in the Select Committee on China and in this committee and in the Financial Services Committee on which I serve. Restrictions on capital flows to China should be aligned with our export controls regime and limited to capturing outbound investments that circumvent the spirit of existing export control rules. In other words, why should restrictions or notification regime on outbound American investments in China not also be applicable to what's on an export control list?
And of course, we're working on an outbound investment program, and I know that the Congress is looking at that as well.
Do you have visibility into PRC entity list companies that remain in index funds listed on U.S. or other exchanges?
I do not.
That's what we need. That's what we need. That's what we don't have right now. So we need list coordination, because if we're worried about export controls, if we're worried about companies that are on this entity list, but American investors are unwittingly financing these same companies, that's a problem. That is a gap that we have that we need to fix. And I appreciate your attention to that. Mr. Nathan, and also, believe me, we're going to be talking to Treasury about that problem, because you're doing a good job. You've got a good entity list, but we need coordination so that we're not unwittingly financing these technologies, even if we have export controls. DFC, Mr. Nathan, we've talked about this. DFC must prioritize lower middle income economies defined by the World Bank, but there's some higher income economies where Belt and Road is alive and well. Would you like to have the capability of going into some of those higher income countries that are strategic, like Panama, where China is all over the canal?
Thank you for the question, and I appreciate our previous discussions, Congressman. Congress has provided us the opportunity specifically for energy to operate in high-income countries in Europe through the European Energy Security and Diversification Act. If Congress moved forward other legislation, we'd obviously work together to make sure that that was aligned with our objectives and our mission under the BUILD Act. As you and I have discussed previously, some of the World Bank income classifications are a little bit clumsy in terms of the countries where we can operate.
And last question to you. Due to budgetary treatment of DFC equity investment, DFC has not been able to fully unlock this tool. How can we help you with that?
Oh, excellent question, and thank you for asking it. Equity is a very important tool for us to be forward-leaning on risk, to be able to fund infrastructure projects, companies, and other projects that meet the needs of the countries where we're operating and give them the choice that they're looking for as an alternative to the state-directed investment from the PRC. The current budgetary treatment doesn't allow us to fully realize the promise of the tool, and I believe what the intention of the BUILD Act was. We're looking for a way to fix that so that we can have more certainty and a larger amount of equity to deploy to fulfill our mission. An equity fix would be very useful.
Thank you. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman, but I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, on this issue that companies on the BIS entity list need to be included on Treasury's CMIC sanctions list. And I yield.
And I agree with the gentleman, and I will be working very diligently on that. And I also agree with the equity issue. We need to fully fund the equity. Otherwise, you cannot fulfill what Congress intended. So with that, Chair now recognizes Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. Assistant Secretary Creighton-Brink, I want to start with you and zoom out a little bit. I think we spend a lot of time talking about strategic competition, and I think the administration has rightly identified the PRC as a challenge and taken several actions engaged in strategic competition. But I would like to hear from you, what are we competing for? And what is the administration's end goal with China so that we're not just talking about competition as an end in and of itself?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much for the broad strategic question. We're competing for and fighting for the kind of region that we want to live in. We talk about a free and open region where countries can freely pursue their interests and where people in those countries can enjoy freedom. We're talking about an interconnected region where we work closely with our allies, partners, and friends. We're talking about a prosperous region, right, where everyone benefits from free and unfettered trade. We're talking about a secure region where disputes are resolved peacefully and we counter threats to security. And we're talking about a resilient region that has the capacity to respond to transnational threats like climate change and the pandemic disease. We're fighting for freedom and democracy as well. That's what we stand for. It's an affirmative vision. That's where I start and end my day every day. What are we doing every day to advance those affirmative goals? As far as our end goal with China, we've talked about the means that we use in our competition, but we also are interested in exploring cooperation where it's in our interest to do so. And at a minimum, whatever we do, we want to keep channels of communication open so that we don't have some kind of a miscalculation that could veer into unintended conflict.
Thank you. And I just think it's really important that we stay focused on those end goals because China's not going anywhere, and we don't want to feed into the CCP's talking points around us just being out to weaken China for the sake of weakening them indefinitely, and figuring out what kind of world we actually want to try and get to. On the question of keeping lines of communication open quickly, I know that Secretary Blinken told Wang Yi that we do want diplomatic engagement and open lines of communication, and he would be prepared to visit Beijing as soon as the conditions allow. When exactly will conditions allow for the visit to be rescheduled, and what conditions are you looking to?
Congresswoman, thank you for your question. Yes, the Secretary did make the decision following the irresponsible and unacceptable intrusion into our airspace of the Chinese high-altitude balloon that he simply could not travel to China at that time and be able to conduct any of the business across the broad-ranging agenda that he had intended to. We did say that he would look to travel when conditions allow. We'll determine what those conditions are and when.
Thank you. Well, I think many of us on the committee would encourage keeping those lines of communication as open as possible, recognizing that it takes two to be able to do that.
Yes, ma'am. I would say, unfortunately, sometimes our Chinese friends have used those channels of communication as a source of leverage, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah. Assistant Administrator Schiffer, I want to go to you. I know we've had a lot of talk about the Belt and Road Initiative and what China's been doing in that regard. I think we sometimes have a temptation to play whack-a-mole with our investments and just feel like we need to show up wherever China is showing up, even if it's not necessarily in our strategic interest. So I just wanted to hear how USAID is viewing this part of their work and how you're thinking about prioritizing strategic investments where we have a comparative advantage instead of just this sort of trying to match one-to-one.
Well, thank you for that question. You know, it is absolutely critical if we're going to be successful in creating the sort of world that we seek to create. As Secretary Crittenbrink laid out, that we are disciplined and strategic in our approach. And I would offer that I think we have been as we look to work with countries that are on the front line of Beijing's coercive economic practices and countries and partners that are critical for our own security and for being able to build the free and open architecture that we seek, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific or around the world. You know, the challenge that we have is that, well, Beijing's model for development assistance isn't actually about development assistance, it's about geostrategic advantage. Our model is premised on being able to create bankable propositions that can attract capital and that can have market access for success. And that is a much trickier proposition. But we are seeking to fully align our work with the strategic priorities of the administration, including in the Indo-Pacific. We're looking to expand our presence there significantly over the course of this year.
Thank you. And I just note we're already seeing many countries where the Belt and Road Initiative has backfired and where countries are starting to sour on Beijing as a result. So I appreciate your strategic approach. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair recognizes now the chair of the Indo-Pacific